Funerals are a service, and where there's a service, there are complaints. Some of them so unhinged they sound fake, make him look angrier, warm up the hands, refund it, it rained. These are 69 real funeral home complaints that prove grief doesn't kill entitlement. 1. You would think making the deceased look peaceful is the main goal, but one funeral director faced the wrath of a confusingly angry family. They filed a formal complaint because their grandfather looked too happy in the casket. Apparently, the man had been a miserable grump for 80 years, and the family felt that the slight smile the mortician gave him was false advertising. They actually demanded the director go back in and make him look angrier to preserve his legacy of being a curmudgeon. 2. A woman left a blistering one-star review for a funeral home in Ohio because the hands of her late husband were cold to the touch during the open casket viewing. She insisted that the staff should have installed some sort of heating element or used hand warmers before guests arrived, so holding his hand wouldn't be so shocking. The director had to politely explain that maintaining a body temperature of 98 degrees is physiologically impossible for someone who has been deceased for 3 days, but she still demanded a discount. 3. We have all heard of being hungry on the job, but one hearse driver took it way too far. A grieving family was following the hearse in a limousine to the cemetery when the procession suddenly pulled into a fast food drive-thru. The driver ordered a double cheeseburger and a large soda while the deceased was still in the back. The funeral home later claimed the driver had low blood sugar, but the family was rightfully horrified that their final ride involved a pit stop for grease and fries. 4. Shopping for a casket is stressful, but one customer treated the showroom like a mattress store. The funeral director watched in disbelief as a man climbed into a mahogany casket, laid down, and then complained that the pillow offered zero neck support. He argued that for $5,000, it should at least be orthopedic. The staff tried to remind him that the intended occupant would not be complaining about back pain or stiff necks, but the customer stormed out, claiming the beds were too firm. 5. Cremation usually leaves very little room for debate, yet one family was convinced they were shortchanged. They weighed the urn upon receiving it and lodged a complaint that it felt too light. Their reasoning was that the deceased was a heavy-set man who weighed nearly 300 pounds in life, so they expected a much heavier urn. The funeral director had to give an awkward science lesson on how combustion works, explaining that fire does not care about your waistline, but they still accused him of keeping some of the ashes for himself. 6. Weather is the one thing money cannot buy, but try telling that to a wealthy client in Florida. After a sudden thunderstorm interrupted a graveside service, the widow demanded a full refund for the entire funeral package. She claimed that the funeral director should have checked the radar and scheduled the burial for a soonier time slot, or at least installed a dome over the cemetery. She genuinely believed that part of the director's job description included controlling meteorological events. 7. Modern problems have officially entered the afterlife. During a particularly emotional visitation, a teenager walked up to the funeral director, not to offer condolences, but to complain that the Wi-Fi signal in the viewing room was weak. He was trying to live stream the event to his followers and was furious that the connection kept buffering. The director had to explain that the building was constructed in the 1920s and was designed for quiet reflection, not for high-speed uploads to TikTok. 8. A family provided a suit for their uncle to be buried in, but they failed to check the pockets first. After the viewing, they remembered that the uncle had a winning lottery ticket in that specific suit jacket. They demanded the funeral home exhume the body immediately so they could retrieve it. When the director explained the massive legal and logistical costs involved in digging someone up for a piece of paper, the family threatened to sue for theft, convinced the mortician had already stolen the ticket and cashed it. 9. Music sets the tone for everything, especially a final goodbye. One funeral home received a furious email after a mix-up with the playlist. The family had requested a specific religious hymn, but due to a Bluetooth pairing error, the speakers blasted "Another One Bites the Dust" by Queen as the pallbearers began moving the casket. While a few cousins in the back found it hilarious, the widow was mortified and accused the staff of playing a sick, intentional prank. 10. It is rare to complain that someone looks too good, but it happened. A man complained that the makeup artist had done such an incredible job on his late wife that it was giving him anxiety. He told the management that she looked so alive, he kept waiting for her to sit up and ask for a glass of water. He wanted them to tone down the makeup and make her look a bit more dead so he could get closure, not feel like he was attending a very quiet resurrection. 11. One family was furious about the fit of the suit on their grandfather. They complained that the jacket looked a little loose around the shoulders and demanded the funeral director tailor it immediately. The director tried to explain that the man had lost significant weight during his long illness, and they had provided a suit from his heavier days. The family refused to listen and insisted the funeral home was shrinking the bodies to save space, which is a conspiracy theory I definitely did not see coming. 12. A hearse driver was reported to management for driving too safely. The complaint stated that the driver stopped at red lights and obeyed the speed limit, which the family found disrespectful. They believe that a funeral procession gives you legal immunity to drive like you are in an action movie chase scene. They actually argued that the hearse should have been blowing through intersections to get grandma to the cemetery faster, ignoring the fact that causing another accident is bad for business. 13. Buying a plot in a cemetery is like real estate, and location matters. However, one woman demanded to move her husband's grave a week after the burial because she did not like the neighbors. She claimed the headstone next to him belonged to a man who had a reputation for being a heavy drinker in the 1970s, and she was worried he would be a bad influence on her husband in the afterlife. The director had to explain that peer pressure usually stops when your heart does. 14. A funeral director received a demand for a partial refund based on low attendance. The family had rented a large chapel, expecting hundreds of mourners, but due to a blizzard, only about 10 people showed up. They blamed the funeral home for not having a better marketing strategy or a weather control machine. They argued that since the room was 90% empty, they should only have to pay 10% of the bill, as if they were paying for a concert ticket rather than a service. 15. Logic often goes out the window during grief, but this complaint takes the cake. A daughter was upset that her father was not wearing his glasses in the casket. The funeral director explained that glasses often reflect light and make the deceased look unnatural, so they usually tuck them in the pocket. The daughter started screaming that her father was legally blind and would not be able to find his way to the pearly gates without his prescription lenses on his face. 16. We live in a coupon culture, but there is a time and a place. A man tried to pay for his mother's funeral using an expired Groupon for a completely different funeral home across town. When the director politely rejected it, the man filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau, claiming false advertising. He argued that all funeral homes are basically the same franchise and should honor each other's discounts, similar to how you might use a burger coupon at a different fast food chain. 17. The limousine ride to the cemetery is usually a somber affair, but one group of mourners treated it like a bachelor party. They filed a formal grievance because the limo was not stocked with champagne and vodka. They claimed the service charge on the bill implied an open bar. The driver had to awkwardly explain that state laws generally prohibit open containers in vehicles, and also, getting wasted on the way to bury a loved one is not a standard service package. 18. Recycling is great for the planet, but terrible for the funeral industry. A family asked the director if they could just rent the casket for the viewing and then return it to the showroom floor to get their money back before the cremation. When the director explained that used caskets cannot be resold due to health laws and biohazard concerns, the family left a nasty review calling the business wasteful and accusing them of running a scam to sell more wood. 19. A mortician was accused of silencing the dead, quite literally. A widow complained that her husband's mouth was closed too tightly. She insisted that in life, he was a mouth breather who always had his jaw hanging open while watching television. She wanted the director to pry his mouth open so he would look more natural. The staff had to gently explain that gravity and rigor mortis make an open mouth look terrifying, not natural. But she insisted they were suppressing his personality. 20. Dealing with family drama is part of the job, but funeral directors are not bouncers. One man gave a funeral home a 0-star rating because they failed to tackle his ex-wife when she walked into the parlor. He had verbally told the director he didn't want her there, but he expected the elderly door greeter to physically restrain a grown woman. He claimed the funeral home breached security protocols, forgetting that a chapel is a public place, not a high-security nightclub. 21. Cremation ashes are usually uniform, but one customer got out a magnifying glass. He complained that the consistency of his aunt's ashes was too chunky and not the fine powder he was expecting. He accused the crematory of being lazy and not finishing the job. The director had to have a very uncomfortable conversation about bone density and the pulverization process, explaining that human remains do not turn into baking flour just because you set them on fire. 22. A family was outraged that the obituary photo they submitted looked grainy in the newspaper. The issue was that they had sent a screenshot of a screenshot from a phone that was taken in a dark bar in 2012. When the funeral director suggested using a higher quality image, they refused, claiming he just didn't know how to use Photoshop to enhance it like they do on crime shows. They blamed the funeral home for making their uncle look pixelated in the local paper. 23. Fashion emergencies apparently do not stop at death. A family threw a massive fit because the funeral director put the wrong shoes on the deceased. While that sounds valid, the catch was that it was a closed-bottom casket, meaning the legs and feet were completely hidden under a locked lid. The family insisted that Grandma knows she's wearing Payless shoes instead of her Sunday best, and they made the staff unlock the casket and swap the footwear just 5 minutes before the service started. 24. One customer left a scathing review claiming the funeral home had terrible security. His complaint was that random people from the community were walking in and signing the guest book. The director tried to explain that obituaries are public invitations, and they do not employ bouncers to check IDs at the chapel door. The man was genuinely offended that the funeral home didn't have a VIP list to keep out the neighbors he didn't like, treating the wake like an exclusive Hollywood nightclub. 25. Comfort is key, but usually only for the living. A woman ran her hand along the satin interior of the casket and immediately lodged a complaint about the thread count. She argued that the fabric felt cheap and scratchy and demanded a discount because she wouldn't put cheap sheets on a guest bed. So why would she put them in a coffin? The director had to bite his tongue to stop from saying that the occupant wasn't going to be tossing and turning enough to notice the texture. 26. Parking wars are brutal, but this one was ridiculous. A mourner stormed into the office yelling because the best parking spot right in front of the door was taken. He was furious when he found out that the prime spot was reserved for the hearse. He actually argued that since the dead guy doesn't need to walk, the hearse should park in the back of the lot so the living guests wouldn't have to walk an extra 30 feet in their dress shoes. 27. Real estate is all about location, even 6 feet under. A family demanded to return a cemetery plot 2 days after the burial because they realized the grave didn't have a scenic view. They complained that their father was facing a maintenance shed instead of the rolling hills. The groundskeeper had to awkwardly explain that once the casket is lowered and covered with 6 tons of dirt, the view is technically just darkness, regardless of which direction the headstone is pointing. 28. You can't fix stupid, but you also can't fix a family's own mistake. A family hired their own independent pastor to conduct the service, but when he accidentally called the deceased Bob instead of Bill for 20 minutes, they blamed the funeral home. They demanded a refund on the room rental, claiming the funeral director should have tackled the priest or cut his microphone the moment he got the name wrong. They refused to accept that the funeral home had zero control over the clergy they brought themselves. 29. The DIY movement has gone too far. A family tried to save money by building their own casket out of plywood and shelf brackets from a hardware store. When the bottom fell out during the transport, thankfully before the body was inside, they blamed the funeral home staff for mishandling it. They screamed that the director should have reinforced their shoddy carpentry with industrial glue before moving it, refusing to admit that using a bookshelf as a coffin was a terrible idea from the start. 30. Temperature control is a constant battle in mortuaries. One family filed a complaint that the viewing room was freezing cold. When the staff explained that they keep the temperature low to help preserve the body and the floral arrangements, the family didn't care. They demanded the thermostat be cranked up to 75 degrees. The director had to bluntly tell them that if they turned on the heat, the room would start smelling very unpleasant very quickly, which finally ended the argument. 31. One woman accused the funeral home of a bait-and-switch scam regarding cremation jewelry. She had bought a tiny locket to hold a pinch of ashes but complained that the funnel provided was too small and she couldn't fit all of him inside. She genuinely thought the entire volume of an adult human's ashes was supposed to fit into a necklace pendant the size of a dime. She accused the director of giving her too many ashes just to spite her. 32. Speed is usually a virtue, but not in this industry. A man called the funeral home 3 hours after dropping off his father's body, screaming about why the ashes weren't ready yet. He compared the cremation process to a pizza oven, assuming it takes about 20 minutes at high heat. The director had to explain that it takes several hours for the process and cool down, to which the man replied that they needed to upgrade their equipment to a microwave system to get customers out faster. 33. A funeral home received a formal letter of complaint regarding the background music. The family was upset that the instrumental music played in the hallway was too sad. They argued that the somber violin music was bringing down the mood and making people cry. The director was baffled, as making people cry is generally the expected outcome of a funeral. The family suggested that next time, the home should play some upbeat top 40 hits to keep the energy levels up. 34. Paranoia runs deep when money is involved. A man accused the funeral home of predatory upselling because there were boxes of tissues placed on every table and chair. He was convinced that if his family used the tissues, they would be charged $5 per box on the final bill, like a hotel minibar. He went around the room collecting all the Kleenex boxes and hiding them in his car to protect his inheritance, leaving the other crying guests to wipe their eyes on their sleeves. 35. Technology creates the most awkward moments, especially when the deceased is involved. A family filed a furious complaint because a cell phone started ringing from inside the casket during the eulogy. It turns out they had insisted on burying Grandpa with his phone in his pocket, but they forgot to turn it off. Instead of owning the mistake, they yelled at the funeral director for not having a signal jammer installed in the chapel to prevent embarrassing interruptions from the afterlife. 36. A woman demanded a full refund for her husband's cremation because she claimed the ashes didn't look like him. I'm not sure what she was expecting. Maybe a pile of dust shaped like a silhouette, but she was adamant that the gray powder in the box was generic. She accused the funeral home of using stock ashes from a bulk bin instead of actually cremating her husband, simply because the remains didn't have a spiritual vibe that matched his personality. 37. One family treated the hearse driver like a personal chauffeur service. They lodged a complaint because the driver refused to stop at a grocery store on the way to the cemetery, so the family could pick up ice and beer for the after-party. They argued that since they rented the vehicle by the hour, they should be allowed to run errands. The driver had to explain that parking a 20-foot hearse with a body inside at a supermarket is generally frowned upon. 38. A man was outraged that the flowers on his mother's grave had wilted. He called the funeral home 2 weeks after the burial, screaming that he had paid good money for those arrangements and expected them to last at least a month. The director had to give a basic biology lesson explaining that cut flowers, once severed from their roots and left in the blazing sun, tend to die. The man still insisted they should have used preservative spray or watered them daily. 39. We have all heard of being late to your own funeral, but this was ridiculous. A family showed up 45 minutes late to the service and then filed a complaint that the funeral director had started the clock on their rental time without them. They argued that the hour of service should only begin when they decided to walk through the door, not at the scheduled time. They demanded the staff stay an extra hour for free to make up for their own lack of punctuality. 40. One customer complaint was straight out of a soap opera. A widow was furious that the funeral home allowed her late husband's mistress to attend the viewing. She claimed that the staff should have known about the affair and acted as security guards to keep that woman out. The poor funeral director had to explain that they are morticians, not private investigators, and they had no way of knowing who was on the naughty list in the deceased's personal life. 41. A very thrifty man tried to return a cremation urn 3 days after the service. He had emptied his wife's ashes into a decorative cookie jar at home and brought the expensive brass urn back to the funeral home, asking for a refund since he didn't need it anymore. When the director explained that they cannot resell a used urn due to biohazard laws and general ethics, the man threw a fit, calling it a scam to force people to buy reusable metal pots. 42. You have to feel bad for the staff who dealt with this one. A family provided a set of dentures for their grandmother, but grabbed the wrong pair from the nursing home nightstand. When the mortician couldn't get the oversized teeth to fit into her mouth, the family complained that he was incompetent. They accused him of breaking her jaw or distorting her face, refusing to believe that they had actually brought in the teeth belonging to her roommate down the hall. 43. Outdoor weddings have weather plans, but outdoor funerals are at the mercy of the elements. A woman complained that the cemetery ground was too muddy and ruined her designer heels. It had rained for 3 days straight prior to the burial, so naturally the ground was soft. She blamed the funeral home for not laying down hundreds of feet of red carpet across the entire grass field so she could walk to the gravesite without getting dirt on her shoes. 44. Prepaying for a funeral is responsible, but demanding a refund for survival is insane. A man stormed into a funeral home demanding his money back for a prepaid package he bought for his wife 5 years ago. His reasoning? She had recovered from her illness and was perfectly healthy. He was genuinely angry that she hadn't died on schedule and felt that the funeral home should refund him because his investment hadn't paid off yet. 45. A family complained that the funeral director did not censor their slideshow. They had handed over a USB drive with hundreds of unorganized files and asked for a video tribute to be played on the big screen. Halfway through the service, a few very compromising, adult-only photos of the deceased popped up. The family was mortified, but they blamed the staff for not sifting through every single private file to remove the nudity they had provided themselves. 46. The pallbearers have a heavy job, literally. But one family wasn't satisfied with their performance. They filed a complaint that the professional pallbearers hired by the funeral home were too short. The family claimed that the casket was tilted at a weird angle because the guys in the front were shorter than the guys in the back. They argued that for the price they paid, the funeral home should have a team of 6 men who are all exactly 6 feet tall for aesthetic symmetry. 47. Everyone grieves differently, but this complaint was baffling. A woman was upset that the funeral director didn't cry during her husband's service. She felt his dry eyes were a sign of disrespect and poor customer service. She actually stated in her review that a good funeral director should shed at least a few tears to show they care. The director had to politely clarify that if he cried for every single person he buried, he would be dehydrated and emotionally catatonic by noon on Tuesday. 48. A family was furious that the limousine they ordered was black. They claimed they had assumed all limos were white, like the ones used for weddings and prom nights. When the sleek black car arrived, they refused to get in, shouting that black cars are too depressing and bad luck. The driver stood there confused, wondering if they realized they were going to a funeral, not a bachelorette party in Vegas, where black is literally the standard color for the occasion. 49. One man tried to negotiate a discount based on his own physical labor. He offered to dig the grave himself with a shovel from his garage to save the opening and closing fees. When the cemetery explained that there are strict laws, unions, and heavy machinery required to dig a 6-foot hole safely, he accused them of running a monopoly on dirt. He genuinely believed he could dig a perfect rectangular grave in an hour without the walls collapsing on him. 50. A woman complained that her mother's obituary was placed next to a mattress advertisement in the local newspaper. She blamed the funeral home for the layout of the paper, accusing them of coordinating with the mattress store to make a cruel joke about eternal rest. The funeral director had to explain that once they submit the text, the newspaper's editor decides where things go, and he has absolutely no control over the placement of discount foam ads. 51. A family was outraged because the funeral home refused to serve alcohol during the visitation. They had brought several coolers of beer and wine, expecting to turn the viewing room into a cocktail lounge. When the staff told them that their license didn't permit alcohol consumption on the premises, the family accused them of being buzzkills and ruining the celebration of life. They ended up drinking in the parking lot like teenagers before stumbling back in to pay their respects. 52. One customer left a 1-star review because the funeral home didn't have a phone charger he could borrow. He was sitting in the front row during the service, playing games on his phone, when his battery died. He walked out in the middle of the eulogy to ask the staff for a lightning cable. When they didn't have one handy, he got angry, claiming a professional establishment should have charging stations for guests who get bored during long speeches. 53. A woman demanded a refund for the guest book because nobody famous signed it. She had apparently expected the funeral to be a bigger social event and was disappointed that only family and neighbors showed up. She blamed the funeral director for not putting the obituary in larger national newspapers to attract a higher caliber of mourners. She honestly felt that the lack of VIP signatures devalued the memory book she had purchased. 54. A man complained that the hearse drove too smoothly. He was upset that the ride was so gentle it felt meaningless. He argued that a funeral procession should feel heavy and dramatic, and the smooth suspension took away the gravity of the moment. He actually said he wanted to feel potholes so he could feel the journey. The driver was left wondering if he should have aimed for construction zones. 55. One family was furious that the funeral home wouldn't let them take the flower stands home. They understood the flowers were theirs, but they assumed the large brass pedestals and vases were included in the price of the bouquet. When the staff stopped them from loading the heavy metal equipment into their truck, they accused the funeral home of theft. They claimed that possession is 9/10 of the law, even though they were trying to steal property worth hundreds of dollars. 56. A very confused customer called to complain that he hadn't received his death certificate bonus check. He had heard from a friend that the government pays you money when someone dies, confusing a life insurance payout or social security benefit with the actual death certificate paper. He yelled at the funeral director for withholding his government check, convinced that the paper certificate itself was redeemable for cash at the bank like a winning lottery ticket. 57. A family demanded that the funeral home exhume their father's body a week after the burial because they forgot to put his dentures in. They weren't worried about how he looked. They were genuinely concerned he wouldn't be able to eat in the afterlife. They were willing to pay thousands of dollars just to open the grave, open the casket, and slide the teeth into his pocket so he could enjoy the heavenly buffet. The director had to have a very theological discussion to talk them out of it. 58. A woman lodged a complaint because the funeral director refused to let her dog look into the casket. She claimed her poodle needed closure, just as much as the human family members did. When the director explained that health codes prohibit animals from being lifted up to an open casket, she accused him of being speciesist. She argued that her dog was more family than some of the cousins who showed up and deserved a final goodbye kiss. 59. A family refused to pay the final bill because they swore the man in the casket wasn't their uncle. They claimed he looked too young and handsome to be the guy they knew. They made the director check the toe tag and wristbands 3 times to prove it. It turned out the mortician had just done an amazing job with the makeup and a close shave, but the family was so used to seeing him look disheveled that they genuinely didn't recognize him when he was cleaned up. 60. A customer left a negative review stating the funeral home was too quiet and depressing. He compared the atmosphere to a library and said it made him feel uncomfortable. He seriously suggested they should have televisions playing sports or news in the lobby to liven the place up a bit. The director had to explain that most grieving families prefer a peaceful environment over the noise of a football game or breaking news alerts while they're trying to say their final goodbyes. 61. A man called the funeral home furious that his wife's ashes were the wrong color. He insisted they should have been pure white, not gray, because she was a very clean and positive person. He accused the crematory of doing a sloppy job and mixing her remains with someone else's negativity. The director had to explain that ash color depends on bone density and temperature, not personality traits or spiritual alignment. 62. A woman complained that there was no popcorn or snacks served during the actual funeral service. She argued that sitting for an hour listening to speeches made her hungry, and the funeral home should provide concessions like a movie theater. She was genuinely offended that she had to wait until the reception to eat. The director had to politely explain that the sound of people crunching on chips and slurping sodas during a eulogy is generally considered disrespectful to the deceased. 63. A family was distressed that their tall father looked cramped in the casket. Even though he fit perfectly within the dimensions, they felt his legs looked uncomfortable. They asked the director if they could cut holes in the bottom of the casket so he could stretch his legs out. The director had to remind them that the deceased do not suffer from leg cramps or poor circulation, and compromising the structural integrity of the box was not a viable option for burial. 64. This might be the most paranormal complaint on the list. A woman demanded a refund because she claimed the funeral home let a ghost follow her home. She said that ever since the visitation, her lights had been flickering, and she blamed the funeral director for having loose spirits wandering around the building. She actually wanted them to pay for an exorcist to cleanse her house, insisting it was a liability issue, just like a slip-and-fall accident on their property. 65. A man complained that the dirt used to fill the grave was too rocky. He wanted smooth, garden-quality topsoil to cover his mother's casket, not the natural earth that came out of the ground. He argued that the rocks would scratch the paint on the expensive casket he bought. The groundskeeper tried to explain that they put the exact same dirt back in the hole that they took out, and the casket is literally designed to be buried in the ground. Iowa 66. A young man filed a complaint because the funeral home didn't warn him that the body would feel hard. He touched his grandfather's shoulder and was freaked out by the rigidity. He blamed the staff for not putting up caution hard surface signs near the open casket. He claimed he suffered emotional trauma because he expected the body to feel soft like a sleeping person. The director had to explain that rigor mortis is not a customer service failure. It is just biology. 67. A family insisted on dressing the body themselves to save money, but they put the clothes on backward. When the funeral director stepped in to fix it before the viewing, they got angry. They didn't want him to fix it. They wanted him to leave it because Dad always dressed sloppy. Then they demanded a discount on the service fee because they had done the hard work of dressing him, even though the director had to redo everything to make it presentable. 68. A woman asked the cemetery management if they could install a solar-powered Wi-Fi hotspot on her husband's headstone. When they said no, she filed a complaint saying the cemetery was stuck in the dark ages. She wanted to be able to sit by the grave and watch Netflix on her tablet without using her own data plan. She argued that offering free internet to mourners would be a great selling point for their plots and help people stay longer. 69. To end on the most ridiculous note possible, a family demanded a refund 2 days after the funeral because they had a dream that their aunt was still alive. They were convinced the funeral home had buried a living person by mistake based solely on a nightmare one niece had. They demanded an exhumation at the funeral home's expense to check her pulse. The director had to gently explain that a coroner, a doctor, and an embalmer had all confirmed she was definitely not waking up. Now your turn. Which complaint crossed the line into "you shouldn't be allowed to leave reviews"? And which one would you secretly defend if it was your family? Drop the numbers and don't explain too politely. If this video broke your brain at least once, hit like and subscribe. You're clearly built for this series.